My name is Cillian McHugh. I'm sort of based in Limerick, sort of the west of Ireland, and I've been interested in morality for quite a long time. And I also just want to say a massive thank you to Jim and Melton for the invitation to speak here. It's just a really exciting seminar series. Every time I turn up, there's just really exciting and interesting talks going on, and I'm delighted to be a part of it. And thank you for the invitation to take part. So when I think of morality, I think of when I was a kid and I used to watch cartoons, and there was always a goodie and a baddie. And it was always really easy to tell who was who because the baddie was clearly codified as a bad guy and the good guy was very obviously the good guy. And then for some cartoons, then there wasn't clearly a good guy and a bad guy. And there was just a bunch of characters that interacted. So for example, I watched Arthur when I was a kid. I don't know if anybody else did. But there was clearly no bad guy in this show, but sometimes maybe Francine mightn't be very nice. She might be a bit mean. And when she was mean, I was, as a kid, would be like, oh, she must be the bad guy then. She must be the baddie. So I was sort of trying to sort of put order and structure on something that's actually much more complex and not actually sort of very straightforward. And I think sort of Rupert Giles in Buffy the Vampire Slayer has summed it up quite well when he ironically says that it's terribly simple. The good guys are always stalwart and true, and the bad guys are easily distinguished by their pointy horns or black hats, and we always defeat them and save the day. Nobody ever dies, and everybody lives happily ever after. And Buffy responds quite appropriately by calling him a liar. So morality is a mess. And studying morality then is equally messy and difficult. To sort of sum up what I'm going to do then, I'm going to give you some background as to why I ended up developing this new theory of moral judgment as categorization. I'll try and explain to you what it is. I know I've only got 15 minutes, so that might be quite tricky. And then I'll contrast it with some existing approaches, and then I'll finally give some conclusion. So when I started my PhD, I was interested in why people make moral judgments and what's going on under the hood when people make moral judgments. And the existing approaches that were available just didn't quite do the job for what I was looking for. Prinz talked about emotions and sort of attributed the entire process of moral judgments to emotional affect. Haidt, when you read into the detail of what Haidt was talking about, he used analogy and metaphor to explain the cognitive mechanisms at play. So intuitions as phonemes, or the brain has a kind of a gauge or a likeometer. And that really didn't sort of explain what was going on for the cognitive mechanisms. Green proposed his dual process approach, which contrasted emotion versus cognition. But again, these weren't really well defined and they didn't really explain what was going on sort of behind the scenes. And then there was other approaches, for example, theory of dyadic morality, which were sort of well laid out, but they discussed the content of the judgment as opposed to the process, which sort of didn't quite answer exactly what I was looking for either. So I then went down in the rabbit hole and just read and read and read. I sort of read about emotions, I read about ecological psychology, I read about embodiment, I read about learning and memory. And after a lot of reading for about 9 months or a year, I sort of came across these two papers, which sort of really did the job for me. So the first one was Lisa Feldman-Jarrett's work, where she describes emotions as instances of categorizations. And then the type of categorization that she's drawing on is the work of Barcelou and his sort of categorizations as situated simulations. So having found this idea that motions are categorizations, I was like, great, this will solve my sort of dilemma of, well, what's the role in moral judgment? I'll take this idea of emotions and apply it to the moral domain. And as I did it, then it became apparent to me that actually that's an extra step in what is actually a simpler story. And it became clear to me that actually moral judgments can be viewed as categorizations. And sort of the evidence for this that led me to come to this conclusion was this range of parallels and similarity between phenomena that are already observed in both literatures. So in categorization, we've got cultural influences, social influences, developmental influences, emotional influences, and the same types of influences are showing up in morality at the same time. And down towards the bottom of the list, I've got typicality. So typicality was something that is observed in the categorization literature. And from my reading, I hypothesized it in the morality literature, and this was in 2014. And then Gray's work in 2015 sort of went on to show that, yes, there are typicality variations in the morality literature. So it's sort of, he confirmed what I was thinking. So the types of explanations for these effects are quite similar. So you can see here I've got a couple of citations where they talk about order effects, language effects, emotion effects, and typicality in kind of the same language, and it's kind of described in the same way. So that was what led me to think that actually maybe the cognitive processes involved are similar or are doing the same thing. So then trying to explain what MJAC actually is. So the three premises of MJAC is that when we make a moral judgment, it is an act of categorization. We are categorizing something as morally wrong or morally right, or identifying something as a member of the category morally wrong or morally right. The cognitive processes involved are domain general, so there isn't a specific moral faculty involved. And then these categorizations are context sensitive, highly dynamical, and always occur as part of goal-directed activity. The predictions then are that stability emerges through continued and consistent type token interpretation, and I'll explain that on the next slide, and that robustness emerges through consistency across multiple contexts. So to explain type token interpretation, it is at its basic form just the identification of an item as a member of a particular category. And that can be explicit or implicit. It doesn't have to be explicitly naming the category and the category member. It can just be part of your activity, how you engage with the particular category members and the categories. So for example, Barcelar uses this idea of things to pack into a suitcase. So this is an ad hoc goal-derived category that we don't necessarily think of in our everyday life, but when it comes to a time when we have to form that category because we're traveling somewhere, we are readily able to do that. We can pick our toothbrush, our toothpaste, our socks, our towel, the spare soap, everything that goes in that category, things to pack into a suitcase, we are able to identify as relevant and put it into our suitcase. And people who travel more often will become better at forming this category, things to get back into a suitcase, more skilled. It will become more habitualized. And so that's how then the more practice you have at forming the category makes it more habitualized, more intuitive, more automatic. So that's what's sort of driving the intuitions or the intuitive nature of the categories. So applied to the moral domain then, as we interact with people, we sort of identify them, maybe explicitly, maybe implicitly, as members of the category, right or wrong, or behaviors. So if you think of taboo behaviors, we think of them as wrong, but we don't talk about them. So that avoiding conversation around these taboo behaviors is implicitly type token interpretation, where we identify them as members of the category morally wrong, but then we don't actually discuss them. So then we are dumbfounded when asked to provide reasons for these categorizations. Barcelar describes this sort of further, so we can with the category fruit. And if we think about this example sort of illustrates how goal-directed activity influences the categorizations that we make. So if we think of the category, the things that are members of the category fruit, we've got apples, we've got bananas, and we've got pineapples. But I'm going to put in tomato onto the screen because by the scientific definition, tomato contains the seeds, so technically tomato is a fruit. But we don't necessarily see tomato as a fruit because we don't eat it in the same way as we eat bananas and apples and oranges. It's sort of more of a salad to us. So that illustrates how our interactions with categories and category members influences how they are subsequently categorized. So for the next couple of slides, I'm going to show sort of a rough outline of what dual processes look like, and then I'm going to sort of reconfigure it as to what MJAC or how MJAC would look at it. So dual process approaches identify predictors of deontological judgments and utilitarian judgments, where affective processing generally leads to deontological judgments and cognitive deliberation leads to utilitarian judgments. There's different ways there's different terminology involved. You can call it automatic or controlled, and emotion and cognition can influence these systems to push the judgment in one direction or the other. We can call it automatic emotional or cognition and reasoning. And Green proposed this personal versus impersonal distinction that pushes sort of personal judgments down the deontological route and impersonal judgments down the utilitarian route. Crockett and Cushman have both independently conceptualized it as model-free versus model-based, where when we're judging actions, they sort of go down the model-free route and end up being deontological judgments. And when we're focusing on the outcomes, then it's model-based and it goes down the utilitarian judgment route. So across a range of different approaches, we see this pattern of different ways of looking at automatic versus controlled, leading to either deontological judgments or utilitarian judgments. But these don't necessarily account for all the available contexts. So here we have a list of other known context effects in the morality literature that aren't actually that well incorporated into dual processes. So we've got intentionality, evitability, benefit recipient, trustworthiness, social evaluation, order effects, the doctrine of double effect. All of these we know influence people's moral judgments, but their role within these dual process frameworks isn't quite clear. So with MJAC, I propose a different way of looking at it. Again, I'm stepping back from looking at content. So I'm not looking at predictors of utilitarianism versus deontological. I'm just looking at predictors of the judgment. So the current goal is the main predictor. And then we also have level of skill. And this is the amount of previous experience with that particular categorization, or how much type token interpretation has happened in the past. And then we've also got contextual influences. This level of skill, then, we can sort of pull this apart and identify it as highly skilled, highly automatic, highly habitual versus sort of less skilled, sort of more novel types of categorizations. We've got habitual versus deliberative. We can also look at it as automatic versus controlled. And then all the things that we saw in the dual processes then fall under this same same banner. So instead of two separate processes, I position them at either ends of a continuum. And then all the context effects that pose a problem for the dual process approaches are now sort of incorporated in this. We also have the ability to incorporate emotions like incidental disgust or moral outrage or anger are all incorporated. And then the context effects described on the previous slides for the dual process approaches also come under context effects here. So impersonal versus outcome versus action versus personal. So that our moral judgments are grounded in our current goals, the level of previous type token interpretation or the level of skill or how habitualized it has become, and then context effects. So the key points then are, I focus on the process, not on the content, and the process then means that our moral judgments are highly dynamical, context sensitive, and always occur as part of goal-directed activity. I explicitly reject the idea of rules governing these categorizations, as does Barcelou, and that it's our prior experience and the sort of the consistency with which these categorizations have previously been made that lead to their stability when we sort of make them at a future juncture. So we don't have a set of rules as to what belongs in the category things to pack into a suitcase. We just know from doing it over the years that these are all the things that belong in the suitcase. Because this approach focuses on domain general processes, I also reject the idea of a moral essence. And then to incorporate the idea that it's based on a skill-based continuum rather than discrete dual processes. This allows us to explain sort of phenomena that aren't that well explained in the literature. For example, the idea of harmless wrongs. I mentioned that in the dumbfounding example earlier, but also the flip side where wrongless harms, where there's something that causes harm isn't viewed as wrong. So playing contact team sports can cause harm, but we don't see it as wrong because our learning history has shown that it's not wrong. Typicality in moral judgments is context dependent, and then there's just a range of contextual influences on our moral judgments. And I want to conclude by saying that I don't think that this is a replacement for existing work. I think it builds on and incorporates existing work. So the action outcome distinction, the emotion cognition distinction, the intentionality, all of these are contextual influences that are incorporated into the model. And it's still possible to see sort of stable patterns emerging. So deontological judgments, like it's wrong to hit, sort of will become sort of more intuitive, more habitual because of the way they're made, as opposed to utilitarian judgments where we sit down and think about the best allocation of resources. And I want to finish by saying thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Cillian. That was really interesting and clearly very comprehensive approach. I think your training in philosophy really comes out with that sort of big picture conceptual taxonomy approach in a way that sometimes we don't do as much in psychology. So yeah, very impressive and interesting work. And we do have a few questions in the Q&A. So I'm going to go just in the interest of hearing from different people in order. So Dakwing Liu has asked, in terms of your metaphor of fruits, would you say that they're prototypes for our moral or immoral categorization, e.g. harms and dyads?
Absolutely. I think so. I think like Gray's work has really sort of identified the best examples. In the paper, I talk about this approach, Barceloo's approach, is quite similar to the exemplar approach, but is different because the range of context effects at play is broader. But yes, absolutely, this sort of good example or of things that are the ones that we see the most frequently then so yes, harm-based judgments are what we see the most frequently, but it's not a rule of harm. It's just that actually, yeah, that harm is wrong, that harm is wrong, that harm is wrong. And collectively, we see lots of harms as wrong.
Great, thank you. And then we're gonna go to Joanna Demery Cotton, who said, fantastic talk, thank you. Does the learning history as an explanation of why things are categorized as wrong or not wrong end up being a little bit empty? So it's categorized as wrong because we previously categorized it as wrong. And she'd just like to hear a bit more about that.
Yeah, I think so. That is a limitation, and I again, I acknowledge it in the paper. But it's also something that is a limitation. If true, it's a limitation to all the approaches. You know, all the approaches have to have to acknowledge that learning history plays a role, and we explicitly say, yeah, well, this is what's going on. We need to figure out so we need to explicitly acknowledge it and sort of address it. And I just want to mention, like my supervisor is fairly philosophy heavy, but my training is still psychology, despite what maybe I just think about things too much.
Great. Thank you so much. So we do have one more question from Lucia, but if you want to answer that in the chat, respond to that in text, just so we can move on with good time. So thank you so much, Cillian.